It started with the footsteps. At first, they were soft, barely noticeable over the low hum of my old apartment's heating system. I didn't think much of it the first few times I heard them. This building is old, built decades ago, and it creaks and groans all the time. But these sounds were different. They were steady, rhythmic, and too deliberate to ignore. It felt like someone was walking slowly down the hallway, taking their time. The sound would stop for a moment and then start again, as if whoever it was couldn't decide where to go. I live alone on the 4th floor, and my hallway is short, with only a few other apartments. It's rare to hear anyone out there late at night. Most of my neighbors are elderly or families who keep to themselves. That's why, even though I tried to ignore it, something about those footsteps made me uneasy. I turned the TV volume up to drown out the sound, but it didn't help. They kept coming, louder now, each step creaking closer and closer to my door. At first, I thought it was my neighbor, Mrs. Carlson. She's in her 70s and often forgets her keys. When that happens, she usually waits in the hallway for her daughter to come let her in. That had to be it. Just Mrs. Carlson pacing back and forth, maybe worried her daughter was running late. Still, something didn't sit right with me. It went on for so long that I couldn't relax. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I stood up, walked quietly to my front door, and peeked through the peephole. The hallway outside was completely empty. There was no one there. The lights flickered faintly, as they sometimes do, but the space was still and silent. A shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't cold in the apartment, but my skin prickled like a draft had crept through. I stared at the empty hallway for a few more seconds before pulling back. I laughed nervously to myself, shaking my head. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe the old building had played a trick on me. I told myself it was nothing and went back to my couch, trying to focus on the show I'd been watching. But the strange feeling in my chest lingered, a tightness I couldn't explain. The next night, it happened again. This time, the footsteps were louder. Heavier, as if someone was purposely making their presence known. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just the building settling or maybe one of the neighbors moving around. But as the sound grew closer, my heart started to pound. The pacing stopped right outside my door, and I froze. The apartment was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven. Slowly, I stood up and moved toward the door, careful not to make any noise. My hand shook as I reached for the peephole. I leaned forward, my face so close to the door that I could feel its cold surface against my cheek. What I saw made my stomach drop. Standing in the hallway was a man. He was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so, and dressed in a faded gray suit that looked decades old. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his face was sharp, his cheekbones jutting out like they didn't belong. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. They were deep-set and shadowed, as if he hadn't slept in years. Even through the distorted lens of the peephole, I could feel his gaze. He wasn't looking around, or at his phone, like someone who might have been lost. He was staring straight at my door. My chest tightened, and I stepped back quickly, my heart thundering in my ears. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out to him? Should I pretend I wasn't home? My throat felt dry as I tried to muster the courage to say something. Finally, I called out. "Can I help you?" My voice was shaky, more like a whisper than the strong tone I wanted. The man didn't respond. He didn't move. He just kept standing there, staring. After what felt like forever, he finally turned, his movements slow and stiff, and walked away down the hall. His footsteps faded until the building was silent. I waited a few minutes before looking through the peephole again, but the hallway was empty. I double-locked my door, my hands trembling, and spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch with every light in the apartment turned on. I didn't sleep at all. The following day, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe it had been a lost visitor or someone in the wrong building. People make mistakes all the time, I thought. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease. The man's face lingered in my mind, the pale skin, the hollow eyes, the way he just stood there, staring. It wasn't normal. I tried to forget about it, but every little noise in my apartment made me jump. When night came, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to hear those footsteps again. Just after midnight, as I was lying on the couch, pretending to watch TV, I heard them. The same, slow, deliberate footsteps, starting at the far end of the hallway. My stomach twisted, and my pulse quickened. Each step closer to my door. I sat up, gripping a pillow tightly in my hands, as if that would somehow protect me. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, just like the night before. I felt frozen in place, unable to move, barely able to breathe. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. I wanted to peek through the peephole again, but fear kept me rooted to the couch. This time, I didn't hear the man walk away. The silence stretched on, and I sat there, waiting for something to happen. Finally, I worked up the courage to creep toward the door. My knees felt weak, and my hands were trembling as I leaned close to the peephole. The hallway was empty. But somehow, that was worse. I pressed my forehead against the cold metal of the door, listening, but all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. I made sure the door was locked, again, and backed away slowly, as if I expected it to burst open at any moment. I left all the lights on and tried to sleep, but every creak, every distant sound, kept me wide awake. The next day, I felt drained, like I hadn't slept in weeks. My mind kept replaying the sound of those footsteps and the image of the man in the gray suit. I tried to focus on normal things, washing dishes, answering emails, making a grocery list, but none of it worked. Every time I passed the front door, I felt my skin crawl. It was like there was something waiting on the other side, even in broad daylight. Was this just paranoia? Maybe the stress from work and being alone so much was finally getting to me. I even considered calling a friend, just to have someone to talk to, but I didn't want to explain what had been happening. What would I even say? There's a man who keeps standing outside my door, but he's not there when I look. It sounded crazy, even to me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the locks on the door at least 10 times before noon. I even went out into the hallway during the day, just to prove to myself there was nothing there. The sunlight streaming through the old windows made the space feel normal, almost comforting. But as I stood there, looking up and down the empty hallway, I couldn't ignore the chill that ran down my spine. By the time evening rolled around, my anxiety was through the roof. I made a point of turning on every light in the apartment, even the ones I never used. The soft glow of the lamps made me feel a little safer, but the fear was still there, creeping around the edges of my mind. When I sat down to eat dinner, I found myself glancing at the door again and again. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps start up, slow and deliberate, just like before. That night, as I lay on the couch pretending to read a book, I promised myself that if it happened again, I would call someone, security, the police, anyone. I wouldn't just sit there and let this fear take over my life. Then, things changed. I was dozing off on the couch, the soft glow of the TV flickering in the dark, when I heard something different. At first, it was just the sound of footsteps again, starting at the far end of the hallway. They were slow, measured, the same as before, and my heart sank into my stomach. But this time, it wasn't just footsteps. There was a faint scratching sound too, like someone dragging their fingers lightly against the walls as they walked. The sound was so soft that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I sat up, clutching the blanket around me like it could shield me from whatever was out there. The footsteps got louder, closer, until they stopped right outside my door. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The scratching continued, soft and steady, almost like a whisper against the wood of my door. My hands gripped the couch cushion so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then, something slid under the door. The faint rustle of paper caught my attention, and I froze. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but when I leaned forward, I could see the edge of a small piece of paper poking out from under the door. I stood up and walked slowly toward it. Every step felt heavier than the last, and my heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was on the other side of the door could hear it. I hesitated before bending down to pick up the paper. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it. The note was written in thin, scratchy handwriting that seemed almost childlike. The message was short, just 4 words.
You don't belong here.
My heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? I didn't belong here? In my own home? I stared at the note, trying to make sense of it, but the words felt like a threat, like they were meant to unnerve me. And they worked. I spent the rest of the night pacing the apartment, jumping at every sound. By morning, I was exhausted, but the fear hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown worse. The next night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. When the footsteps came, I waited until they stopped, until I could feel him standing on the other side of the door. Then, with every ounce of courage I could muster, I flung the door open. But the hallway was empty. The air was cold, heavier than it should have been, and the lights flickered faintly, casting strange shadows on the walls. I stepped out, my bare feet touching the cold floor, and looked up and down the hall.
Who's there?
I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. No answer. I stood there for a moment longer, my chest tight with anxiety, before I finally turned to go back inside. But as I reached for the doorknob, I noticed something strange. The door wasn't mine. The number on it wasn't the familiar 4B of my apartment. Instead, it read 4C, a unit I knew was empty. I froze, my mind racing. How had I gotten here? I turned to look back at the hallway, but it was different now. Longer. Darker. The walls were cracked and stained, and the lights were barely flickering, casting strange, shifting shadows. Panic surged through me. I turned back to the door and tried to open it, but the knob wouldn't budge. I pounded on the wood, shouting, I wanted to get out of that hallway, no matter what apartment it was.
Let me in. Please. Let me in.
The cold, oppressive air seemed to press closer, suffocating me with every passing second. Behind me, the sound of footsteps started again. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned to face the hallway. And there he was, the man in the gray suit. He was closer this time, his hollow eyes fixed on me, his pale face calm but decisive.
You need to stop. What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?
He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head, his gaze steady, like he was trying to read my thoughts. His voice was soft, but firm.
You're confused, but you need to see. You need to understand.
I don't understand anything. This is my home. You can't take it from me.
I stepped back until my shoulders hit the door. My hands fumbled against the cold wood, desperate for an escape. He said quietly,
But you need to see. You need to understand.
What are you talking about? I live here. I'm alive.
The words caught in my throat as the hallway around me began to change. The walls cracked and faded, peeling back to reveal something older. Colder. The air filled with a faint, musty smell. The dim fluorescent lights flickered out, plunging everything into shadow. Then, the man spoke, his voice cutting through the darkness like a blade.
You don't live here. You haven't lived here for a long time.
Suddenly, memories I didn't recognize flooded my mind. The face of an old landlord. The sound of laughter from a life I didn't remember living. The name on the mailboxes at the entrance of the building. Mine. But not the one for 4B. My hands trembled as I looked at the door again. It wasn't 4B. It was 4C.
What is this? Why is this happening?
The man in the gray suit stepped closer. His expression softening, almost like pity.
You lived in 4C. You died in 4C. And when you did, you stayed behind. You forgot. You moved on without moving on. You thought you belonged in 4B, but it wasn't yours. It never was. You've been haunting someone else's home.
His words hit me like a cold wind, sharp and undeniable. Images flashed in my mind. Me. Sitting in the living room of apartment 4B, looking at unfamiliar furniture that somehow felt like mine. The strange unease I felt every time I walked past the door to 4C. The sound of neighbors who never acknowledged me. I don't understand. I can't be dead. I whispered, my knees buckling as I sank to the ground. The man knelt in front of me, his hollow eyes meeting mine. He said gently,
It's time to let go. This isn't your place anymore. It's theirs. They've been trying to live, but your presence has kept them trapped in fear. You've been lost, but now, it's time to find your way.
I shook my head. Tears streaming down my face. I murmured,
No, this is my home. I don't want to leave. I can't leave.
His expression hardened slightly, though there was still kindness in his voice. He said, the words firm but final.
You don't belong here.
At those words, the air seemed to shift. The hallway began to blur. The walls fading into a soft, gray light. The man in the gray suit stood and stepped back. His figure becoming less solid. More ethereal. The door to 4C opened behind me, revealing a warm, golden glow that spilled into the hallway. He said, his voice echoing faintly.
Go. It's time to move on.
The man in the gray suit wasn't just some haunting figure. I see that now. He was an agent from the spiritual world, sent to help me understand the truth I'd been too blind, too afraid to see. That my time in this world had ended, and it was time to let go. I turned toward the open door, the light drawing me in, filling me with a strange mix of fear and peace. I looked back at the man in the gray suit, who gave a single nod. He said,
"You're not alone."
Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the door. As the light surrounded me, the weight of the confusion and fear I'd carried for so long began to lift. The memories of my life, the real memories, returned in flashes: friends, family, moments of joy and pain. A fulfilling life. All leading to this moment. And then, as the light grew brighter, I felt myself let go. Finally, I was free.